It was an unforgettable summer. My cake shop was thriving, and I decided to recruit an assistant. One day, a young man walked into the shop. He looked to be in his 20s, clean-cut and fresh. He looked around and then asked me what I would recommend. I smiled and recommended my most satisfying cupcakes to him. He took a bite and smiled with satisfaction, saying he had never tasted such a delicious cake. A few days later, he came again, saying he really liked my craft and wanted to learn how to make cakes. He also mentioned seeing the job posting on the shop door. That day, a large group of customers suddenly came in, and I was extremely busy. Seeing this, the young man took the initiative to stand behind the counter and help, handling customers and operating the cash register with ease, without any sign of nervousness. Watching his performance, I decided on the spot to hire him. He introduced himself as Brian, saying he had worked in the catering industry and was very familiar with the service sector. Brian's arrival made my life much easier. He was diligent, eager to learn, and meticulous in his work. Within a year, I had almost handed over the entire management of the shop to him. He even took on the responsibility of preparing materials in the basement, as I had injured my knee in the past, and lifting heavy objects was quite strenuous for me. I trusted Brian completely. He kept my shop running smoothly. Recently, Brian has been acting strangely. He has become absent-minded and makes frequent mistakes. When I asked him what was going on, he mumbled something about problems at home but didn't elaborate. One evening, it suddenly occurred to me that the next day was my nephew's birthday. In previous years, I would always make him a special cake. But this time, I had completely forgotten. Considering that I had several big orders to fulfill the next day, I decided to work late at night and drove back to the cake shop. The shop was eerily quiet. I turned on the kitchen lights and began to prepare the ingredients. As I was busy, I suddenly heard a dull thud. I stopped what I was doing. The surroundings were completely silent. Then the sound came again, louder and more urgent this time, thump, 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 knocking rhythmically. I followed the sound and slowly walked over, realizing it was coming from the basement. I pressed my ear to the basement door and listened intently. Thump, 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 it was rhythmic, like someone was knocking. I reached for the light switch and slowly descended the stairs. The air was filled with an indescribable odor. When I reached the basement, the sound stopped. I looked around, the lighting was dim, and the smell grew stronger. The floor was damp, and it seemed Brian had cleaned it. I couldn't help but cover my nose, thinking I should ask Brian to check this place tomorrow. As I turned to go upstairs, the thump, thump, thump sound started again, even more urgent and louder, as if trying to get my attention. I followed the sound to the freezer. The door of the freezer vibrated slightly with each knock, as if someone was pushing hard from inside. I shouted, "Who's in there?" The sound stopped again. This was an old freezer that had long been out of use, but why was there suddenly a lock on it? I saw the freezer was plugged in. Could this be Brian's doing? Then the thump, thump, thump started again. The freezer began to shake slightly. I stepped back in fear and shouted, "Are you okay?" But there was no response. I pulled the plug and quickly grabbed a hammer, trying to pry the lock open while shouting, "Don't be afraid. I'll get you out." The knocking inside the freezer suddenly stopped, as if it understood my words. With all my strength, I struck the lock and finally broke it open. The moment the freezer door opened, a blast of cold air mixed with a heavy stench of blood and decay hit me. So that's where the strange smell had come from. I stood there, stunned. There was no one inside, only several objects wrapped in black garbage bags. Did I just hear things? I touched one of the garbage bags and suddenly felt uneasy. I tried to cut open one of the smaller bags but found it tightly wrapped with multiple layers of tape, making it difficult to open. As I tore open the first layer, I discovered another bag inside. With each layer I removed, the smell grew more pungent. When I finally opened the last layer, a bloodied and mangled hand rolled out. I screamed and dropped the garbage bag to the floor. My legs went weak, and I could barely stand. That night, I immediately called the police. They quickly identified Brian as the suspect, and he was arrested the next day and confessed to everything. The body in the freezer was his girlfriend. Unable to accept her breakup proposal, Brian lured her to the shop's basement for a talk but strangled her in a fit of rage. Fearing discovery, he dismembered her body and hid it in the freezer. Brian claimed he had planned to turn himself in, but he didn't expect me to uncover everything so soon. Fearing discovery, he dismembered her body and hid it in the freezer. Brian claimed he had planned to turn himself in, but he didn't expect me to uncover everything so soon. Many years ago, on a certain night, I received a phone call from my old friend Tom. His voice was tense and hurried, saying he had discovered something amiss in his old house in the suburbs and needed my help. I hesitated for a moment, but then grabbed my coat and drove over. Tom's old house was located in a dense forest. The house was quite old, and the trees around it swayed in the wind, as if whispering untold secrets. When I arrived, Tom was already waiting for me at the door, his face pale and his eyes filled with fear. "I found something terrifying," Tom said, his voice trembling. I followed Tom into the house. The interior was dimly lit, and the air was filled with a musty smell. Tom led me to the entrance of the basement, where a heavy wooden door was tightly shut. "The sound is coming from in there," Tom said, pointing at the door. I took a deep breath and pushed open the wooden door. A cold gust of wind rushed out from the basement, making me shiver. We descended the narrow staircase, each step accompanied by the creaking of old wooden boards. The basement was cluttered with various items, and dust floated in the air. Tom pointed to an old box in the corner, from which the sound seemed to be emanating. "I don't dare open it," Tom said, taking a step back. I slowly approached the box, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out to lift the lid, only to find it locked. I searched around for a tool and eventually found a pair of iron pliers. With all my strength, I broke the chain. I opened the lid, but instead of the monster I had imagined, there was only a pile of old books and some tattered clothes. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I noticed a loose wooden board next to the box. I carefully lifted the board, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. Suddenly, a low groan came from the hole, and my blood nearly froze. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the hole. A pair of bloodshot eyes stared straight back at me. Tom screamed and turned to run. I followed closely, but we found that the staircase had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. We were trapped in the basement. The owner of those eyes began to crawl out of the hole. Its body was twisted, its limbs bent at impossible angles. It had no skin, its muscles exposed to the air, dripping with blood. We searched desperately for an escape, but every door was locked. The creature drew closer, its breathing echoing through the basement. Just as we were about to give up hope, I noticed a stone in the wall that seemed unusual. I pushed it hard, and it moved, revealing a narrow passage. Without hesitation, we crawled into the passage, and the stone fell heavily behind us. We scrambled forward through the passage until we saw a glimmer of light. We finally escaped the old house, and the creature did not follow. After that night, Tom's old house was permanently sealed, and we never spoke of that experience again. Some things are best left in the darkness. During my high school years, I attended a very remote boarding school specializing in ballet. The basement of the school was our dance studio. Down there were two changing rooms, one new, close to the studio, and another old one, tucked away in the farthest corner, long abandoned. However, after 9 p.m., the hot water supply would cease throughout the school, even in the dormitories, except in this old changing room. How did I know? Because I often went there to shower. Our ballet class was fiercely competitive, and it was common for us to practice late into the night, often past 9 p.m. It was a tradition passed down by the seniors that we could shower in the old changing room at night, but with two strict rules: first, never go alone; second, never look into the mirrors. The old changing room had no mirrors, which always struck me as odd. The shower stalls were separated by tiles, each with a lockable door, seemingly normal, yet there was an indescribable sense of oppression. One night, after practicing with Mary, we headed to the old changing room as usual. As we walked and chatted, Mary suddenly asked, "Do you know why we can't come here alone?" I shook my head, laughing. "Isn't it just a legend?" Mary lowered her voice, speaking mysteriously. "It's not just a legend. A few years ago, a senior came here alone to shower and got locked inside. It was during summer break, and the school was empty. When the teachers found her at the start of the term, she was already dead. The wooden door was covered in scratches, the mirror was shattered, and her body, it had turned into a mummy." I felt a chill down my spine but tried to stay light-hearted. Why was she still at school during the summer? Mary made a face at me, half-jokingly saying, "You can ask her yourself." I laughed and chased after her, trying to shake off the unease. We entered the old changing room, the lights flickering as usual. I undressed and was about to enter the shower when Mary suddenly exclaimed, "I forgot my dance shoes in the studio. I need to go back, or the teacher will lock up." I casually replied, "Get them after the shower." But she had already run off, leaving only a quick, "Be right back." Not thinking much of it, I stepped into the shower and began to wash. The hot water relaxed me slightly. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside. Thinking it was Mary returning, I called out, "That was quick." But there was no response. My heart tightened, and I called again, "Mary, is that you?" The footsteps stopped, and everything became eerily quiet. I tried to open the door but found it stuck, as if something was blocking it from the outside. Panic set in as I remembered Mary's story. I started banging on the door, screaming for help. Then, the faucet behind me burst with scalding hot water, making me scream in pain. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the bathroom into darkness. Just as I was on the verge of breaking down, the door slowly creaked open. Trembling, I pushed it open and cautiously stepped out. A cold breeze swept by, and I instinctively turned to look. There, on the far wall, was a mirror. There shouldn't be a mirror here. Reflected in it was a blurry figure of a woman in a tattered ballet dress, her face pale as paper, her eyes hollow, with a grotesque smile on her lips. Her body appeared twisted, her limbs bent at unnatural angles. I was paralyzed with fear, watching as she slowly emerged from the mirror. Her movements were like a manipulated puppet, each step accompanied by a creaking sound. Her hand reached out to me, cold as ice, gripping my neck tightly. I struggled desperately, but her strength was terrifying. My neck felt as if it was about to snap, the pain making it hard to breathe. Gradually, my consciousness faded, and everything turned to darkness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. The nurse told me I had been unconscious for 2 days. The school and my parents were there, and so was Mary. She said that when she returned, she found me lying on the floor, unresponsive. She rushed to get help, but when she returned with others, the door to the old changing room was locked tight. It was only opened with the teacher's spare key. Trembling, I asked Mary, "Was there anyone else there?" She shook her head. I asked again, "Did you see a mirror?" She looked confused. "What mirror? There's never been a mirror there." From that day on, I never dared to go near the old changing room again. Even the dance studio filled me with fear. Every night, I had nightmares about the ballet ghost emerging from the mirror. Eventually, I decided to transfer schools. On the day I left, Mary hugged me and cried. I whispered in her ear, promise me, never go to the old changing room. I left that school, but to this day, the nightmares persist.